Silence is loud, not the kind you choose, but the kind you leave behind. When days pass, then weeks, and no words come, people think silence means strength, but silence has weight. And when you don't break it for too long, it starts speaking for you. Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in slowly, almost politely, like it's giving you time to notice it. At first, he tells himself it's nothing serious. People get busy. Life gets loud. Days pass without words, and he convinces himself that patience is maturity. But deep down, something starts to feel off. Because when someone who once spoke freely suddenly goes quiet, the absence doesn't feel neutral. It feels intentional. Silence in that moment begins to resemble rejection, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. As the silence stretches, his mind starts working overtime. Humans are not built to sit comfortably with unanswered questions. When communication disappears, the brain fills the void with assumptions. He begins replaying conversations, scanning memories for mistakes, searching for the moment where things might have gone wrong. Silence gives him too much space to think and not enough clarity to rest. Each unanswered message feels less like forgetfulness and more like avoidance. And avoidance, to the heart, feels personal. What makes silence especially painful is that it removes the chance to defend oneself. If someone tells you they're upset, you can respond. If they say they need space, you can respect it. But silence offers no explanation, no direction, no rules. He's left standing in emotional fog, unsure whether to move forward or stay still. That uncertainty slowly transforms into self-doubt. He begins asking questions that cut deeper than any argument ever could. Was I too much? Was I not enough? Did I misread everything? Silence also changes how value is perceived. When someone stops communicating, it sends an unspoken message. You are no longer a priority. Even if that was never the intention, that is how it lands. Effort is one of the clearest signs of care, and silence feels like effort being withdrawn. He starts measuring his worth in response times and unread messages. The longer the silence lasts, the smaller he begins to feel, not because his value actually changed, but because silence has a way of making people internalize absence as failure. There's also a unique loneliness that comes with being ignored rather than confronted. Arguments mean engagement. Disagreements mean you still matter enough to be addressed. Silence, however, feels like being erased while still present. He exists, but without acknowledgement. That kind of emotional invisibility can be devastating. It creates the sense that he is speaking into a void, that his presence no longer registers. Over time, this lack of recognition begins to hurt more than harsh words ever could. As days turn into weeks, silence starts reshaping his emotional posture. He becomes guarded, less open, less willing to reach out. Each attempt that goes unanswered feels like another small rejection, and eventually self-protection kicks in. He stops trying, not because he stopped caring, but because caring without response is exhausting. Silence teaches him restraint, not out of strength, but out of survival. He learns to swallow words before they leave his mouth, afraid they'll disappear into nothing. The cruelest part of prolonged silence is that it rarely announces its intentions. There is no official ending, no clear boundary, no explanation to lean on, just distance growing quietly in the background. And while the other person may experience silence as peace, space, or control, he experiences it as exclusion, as emotional abandonment, as a door closing without the courtesy of a sound. Silence doesn't just feel like rejection. It slowly convinces him that rejection is what he deserves. Pride often disguises itself as strength. It tells him that staying silent is a form of self-respect, that not reaching out means he's standing tall, unbothered, unaffected. In the beginning, pride feels empowering. It whispers that silence keeps dignity intact, that speaking first is weakness, that holding back proves control. But pride rarely reveals its true cost up front. It waits. And by the time its price becomes clear, something valuable has already been lost. When silence is driven by pride, it's not peace, it's resistance. He wants to speak, but he convinces himself he shouldn't. He rehearses messages in his head, imagines conversations that never happen, edits sentences that are never sent. Pride turns communication into a battlefield where no one wins. Instead of honesty, there is hesitation. Instead of clarity, there is calculation. And while pride claims to protect him, it slowly distances him from what he actually wants: connection. The problem with pride is that it prioritizes being right over being understood. Silence becomes a shield, not because there is nothing to say, but because saying it would mean lowering defenses. Pride insists that the other person should make the first move, should explain, should fix what's broken. It keeps score. Who spoke last? Who cared more? Who walked away first? And in that silent competition, vulnerability becomes the casualty. Over time, pride reshapes emotional behavior. He begins suppressing his natural instincts to check in, to ask questions, to express concern. Each time he ignores the urge to speak, it becomes easier to stay quiet the next time. Silence turns into habit, and pride reinforces it by calling it discipline. But what's really happening is emotional compression. Feelings aren't disappearing, they're being packed tighter, heavier, harder to manage. Pride also distorts perception. It convinces him that reaching out would lower his value, that explaining himself would diminish his position. But relationships don't operate on hierarchy, they operate on exchange. When pride refuses to bend, communication breaks. What could have been resolved with a simple conversation turns into prolonged distance. Not because the issue was unsolvable, but because pride refused to let anyone step forward without losing face. There's a quiet regret that follows pride-driven silence. It doesn't arrive immediately. It shows up later, when enough time has passed that words feel awkward, out of place, or unnecessary. He looks back and realizes how much energy was spent maintaining silence instead of building understanding. Pride kept him quiet, but it didn't keep him at peace. It simply delayed the pain and multiplied it through distance. As silence continues, pride starts to isolate him. People interpret silence differently than intention. What he sees as self-control, others experience as coldness or indifference. Without communication, assumptions replace reality. He may believe he's preserving respect, but from the outside, it looks like disengagement. Pride doesn't warn him of this disconnect. It reinforces it, convincing him that if someone truly cared, they would push past the silence. Eventually, pride demands a sacrifice. It asks him to choose between holding his position and holding the relationship. And often, without realizing it, he chooses pride, not because it matters more, but because it speaks louder in moments of emotional tension. By the time pride steps aside, the distance has grown comfortable, the silence has settled in, and the opportunity to speak freely has passed. Pride may feel powerful in the moment, but it leaves behind something far heavier than it ever carried: unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and connections that faded not from lack of love, but from lack of humility. Silence has a way of reshaping reality without ever announcing that it's doing so. When communication stops, perception slowly replaces truth. He doesn't receive new information, so his mind begins to reinterpret the old. What once felt stable starts to feel uncertain. Small moments that were once insignificant suddenly feel suspicious. Silence doesn't just pause a relationship. It edits the story he tells himself about it. In the absence of words, the mind becomes a narrator fueled by emotion rather than fact. He starts assigning meaning to pauses, delays, and distance. A missed call feels intentional. A short response feels cold. Silence gives space for imagination, and imagination is rarely kind when reassurance is missing. Without clarity, he assumes the worst, not because he wants to, but because uncertainty demands explanation, and the mind will create one if none is given. Silence also alters how he sees himself. When communication disappears, the question shifts from what happened to what's wrong with me. He begins internalizing the quiet as a reflection of his worth. If he mattered, he thinks someone would speak, someone would explain, someone would try. This shift in perception is subtle but dangerous. It moves responsibility inward, turning silence into a mirror that only shows flaws, never context. As time passes, silence rewrites emotional history. Moments of care are overshadowed by the present absence. Past affection feels distant, almost unreal, like it belonged to a different version of the connection. He starts questioning whether the closeness he felt was mutual or imagined. Silence has the power to make sincerity feel temporary and effort feel one-sided, even if that wasn't always the case. Another change in perception comes through emotional distance. Silence dulls immediacy. What once felt urgent begins to feel irrelevant. Not because it stopped mattering, but because caring without feedback becomes exhausting. His emotional investment slowly declines, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. Silence teaches him to expect less, and in doing so, it changes how deeply he allows himself to feel. Silence also affects how he interprets intention. Without communication, neutrality disappears. Everything becomes either positive or negative, and silence usually falls on the negative side. Even neutral actions are filtered through doubt. A kind gesture feels confusing. A delayed response feels calculated. Silence removes the benefit of the doubt and replaces it with emotional suspicion. Over time, perception hardens into belief. What started as confusion becomes assumption. What began as patience turns into resignation. He no longer waits for words. He adapts to their absence. And once perception settles into a new normal, even the return of communication can feel unfamiliar. Silence doesn't just change how he sees the situation, it changes how he sees connection itself, teaching him that closeness is fragile, communication is uncertain, and meaning can disappear without a single word being spoken. Emotions are not erased by silence, they are reshaped by it. When words go unspoken, feelings don't disappear into nothing. They settle deep inside where they begin to change form. At first, the emotions remain soft concern, longing, hope. He still feels warmth when he thinks about reaching out. He still imagines conversations that could bring clarity. But without expression, those emotions are denied movement, and anything that cannot move eventually stiffens. Silence forces emotions to turn inward. Without an outlet, feelings circulate internally, repeating the same questions, the same doubts, the same memories. What could have been released through honest conversation becomes trapped. Over time, that internal pressure transforms tenderness into tension. Care turns into frustration. Hope slowly becomes guarded expectation. He doesn't stop feeling, he starts feeling differently. The longer emotions stay unexpressed, the more defensive they become. Vulnerability requires response. Without it, vulnerability feels unsafe. He begins protecting himself by limiting emotional exposure. Instead of openly missing someone, he tells himself he shouldn't. Instead of admitting hurt, he minimizes it. This self-protection hardens emotional edges. What was once openness becomes restraint, not because he's healed, but because he's adapting to silence. Silence also alters the emotional tone of memories. Moments that once carried warmth begin to feel heavy. Laughter is remembered alongside absence. Affection is recalled with a sense of loss. The emotional memory hardens, taking on a sharper edge. Even good memories lose their softness when they are not reinforced by present connection. Silence changes how emotions are stored, less as comfort, more as reminder. As emotions harden, expression becomes more difficult. He wants to speak, but now the feelings are no longer simple. They're layered, complex, burdened by time. What could have been said easily earlier now feels too heavy to explain. Silence has aged the emotions. They've gained weight, texture, resistance. Speaking them would require reopening feelings he's been slowly armoring himself against. Hardened emotions also shift behavior. He becomes less reactive, less expressive, less willing to engage deeply. Not because he doesn't care, but because caring has started to hurt in a quiet, ongoing way. Silence teaches emotional control, but not the healthy kind. It teaches suppression, endurance, emotional endurance without resolution. Eventually, emotions reach a point where they no longer seek release. They seek stability. He doesn't need answers as urgently as he once did. He doesn't wait for explanation with the same intensity. The emotions haven't vanished. They've settled into a solid form, less flexible, less vulnerable. Silence didn't kill the feeling. It forged it into something harder, something quieter, something far more difficult to soften again. Detachment doesn't arrive suddenly. It's not a decision he makes in one clear moment. It's a process, slow, quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. In the beginning, he still checks his phone, still expects a message, still holds space in his mind for a response that hasn't come yet. Silence hasn't changed his feelings yet. It has only delayed their confirmation. But the heart, like the mind, learns from patterns. And when silence repeats itself, the heart begins to adapt. Each unanswered moment teaches the heart a small lesson. Don't lean too far forward. Hope, when left unsupported, becomes risky. The heart responds by pulling back, not out of anger, but out of instinct. It starts conserving energy, reducing emotional investment, preparing for disappointment before it arrives. Detachment begins as self-defense. The heart is not trying to disconnect. It is trying to survive without reassurance. As time passes, reaching out starts to feel heavier. What once felt natural now feels like effort. He weighs every word before considering whether to send it, and more often than not, he decides against it. Not because he has nothing to say, but because he's learned what silence feels like on the other side. The heart remembers the emptiness that followed the last attempt, and it chooses restraint over vulnerability. Silence also changes emotional reflexes. When something meaningful happens, his first instinct used to be sharing it. Now he pauses. He considers whether it's worth mentioning, whether it will be received, whether it will disappear into quiet again. Over time, he stops pausing. He simply stops sharing. The heart adjusts to solitude, slowly accepting emotions will remain unacknowledged. Detachment deepens when silence becomes predictable. When absence turns into expectation, hope no longer drives behavior. The heart stops waiting and starts managing distance. Emotional availability decreases, not as punishment, but as preparation. He becomes emotionally lighter on the surface, but heavier inside. Detachment creates calm, but it's a guarded calm, built on lowered expectations rather than peace. What's most unsettling is how normal detachment begins to feel. He adapts to the quiet. He no longer reaches for connection automatically. The emotional bond loosens, not because it was weak, but because it wasn't maintained. Silence teaches the heart how to exist without feedback, without reassurance, without shared emotional rhythm. And once the heart learns that lesson, it doesn't easily forget it. Eventually, detachment stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like balance. He no longer needs the silence to end in order to function. He's adjusted his emotional posture to match the distance he was given. The heart, once open and responsive, has learned to stay partially closed. Not from bitterness, but from experience. Silence didn't push him away all at once. It trained him, patiently and quietly, to step back on his own. Silence has a way of ending things without ever announcing that an ending has occurred. There is no final conversation, no clear explanation, no moment where both sides acknowledge that something has changed. Instead, the connection slowly dissolves in the background, quietly losing shape. He doesn't wake up one day and decide it's over. He simply notices that the waiting has stopped, and with it, something essential has faded. Closure usually comes from understanding, knowing why something ended, what went wrong, or what was never meant to last. Silence denies all of that. It leaves him with unanswered questions that linger long after the connection has weakened. He replays scenarios in his head, trying to construct an ending from fragments. But silence provides no conclusion, only absence. And absence is a poor substitute for truth. Without closure, emotions struggle to settle. The heart doesn't know whether to grieve, hope, or move on. Silence keeps everything suspended. It's not clearly over, but it's no longer alive either. That ambiguity becomes its own form of pain. He can't fully release what was never formally ended, and he can't fully return to something that no longer responds. Silence traps him in between. As time passes, acceptance arrives, but not in a satisfying way. He doesn't accept the ending because it makes sense. He accepts it because resistance becomes exhausting. The unanswered questions remain, but they lose urgency. Not because they were resolved, but because he learned to live with not knowing. Silence forces acceptance without understanding, and that acceptance carries a quiet ache. Silence also reshapes memory. Without a closing moment, everything blurs. The beginning feels distant, the middle feels confusing, and the end feels invisible. There is no clear point to look back on and say, that's when it ended. This lack of definition makes the experience harder to process. The mind prefers clear lines, but silence leaves only fade outs. Even when he moves forward, the lack of closure leaves a trace. Future connections are approached more cautiously. He listens closely for signs of withdrawal, more sensitive to quiet than to conflict. Silence taught him that things can end without warning, without explanation, without respect for emotional continuity. And while he adapts, a part of him still recognizes the loss, not just of the connection, but of the chance to understand it. Silence doesn't slam the door. It leaves it open just long enough to confuse the heart, then slowly lets it close on its own. No goodbye, no final words. Just the realization one quiet day that something meaningful ended without ever saying it was over. So understand this: silence is never empty, and it is never harmless. It shapes emotions, rewrites perception, hardens feelings, and quietly teaches the heart how to leave without walking away. What goes unsaid does not disappear. It lingers, it settles into memory. It becomes the reason someone stopped trying without ever announcing they were done. Words may feel difficult, uncomfortable, or risky, but silence is far more expensive. It doesn't just pause connection. It decides its fate. Because in the end, it's rarely the argument that breaks a bond. It's the quiet that convinces the heart there is nothing left to wait for.